400 against 40,000. A battle so lopsided that history nearly forgot it. But what those 400 Polish cavalry accomplished in 6 hours would redefine what's possible when discipline meets desperation. June 1694. The border between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Ottoman territory was not a line on a map. It was a zone of blood. Decades of conflict had transformed that region into an open wound, where armies clashed and villages vanished overnight. And at the center of this perpetual violence were the Crimean Tatars, nomadic warriors, mounted archers who moved like the wind. 40,000 of them crossed the border. They weren't a traditional army, they were a human flood, a tide of horses and arrows coming to plunder, capture, and destroy. The Crimean Khanate thrived on these raids. Slaves, gold, terror. And then, near a small settlement called Chodov, this colossal force encountered something unexpected. 400 Polish cavalry. They were no ordinary soldiers. 100 of them were hussars, absolute elite. Polish hussars had a reputation that crossed borders. Heavy armor covering every inch of their bodies. Wings fastened to their backs made from eagle feathers or wood that produced a terrifying sound during the charge. And lances. 4-meter lances that transformed each cavalryman into a mobile war machine. These men didn't break. They didn't retreat. They were trained from youth for one thing only: to dominate the battlefield through absolute discipline and overwhelming force. The other 300 were Towarzysz Pancerny regular armored cavalry. Less ornate than the hussars, but equally lethal. If the hussars were the hammer, the Towarzysz were the anvil. Together, they formed a force that shouldn't be underestimated. But the math didn't add up. Not even close. On the other side, the Crimean Tatars represented a completely different philosophy of war. Light cavalry, extreme mobility, mounted archers who attacked, fired, and vanished before the enemy could respond. They didn't fight prolonged frontal battles. There was no need. Their strength lay in numbers, speed, and the ability to encircle and crush any opposition through sheer numerical pressure. 40,000 cavalry, perhaps 70,000. Historical sources vary, but the point is clear. They were an overwhelming horde, a force that should have annihilated any resistance in minutes. So why didn't it happen? The answer begins with terrain. Chodov wasn't an open field. It wasn't an endless plain where Tatar mobility could shine. It was a confined space, abandoned structures, fallen fences, remnants of buildings that offered something critical: cover. The Polish cavalry didn't attempt to face 40,000 men in open field. That would be suicide. Instead, they did something brilliant. They turned Chodov into an improvised fortress. Barriers. Remnants of fences were dragged to form a defensive perimeter. Abandoned structures became anchoring points. Every piece of wood, every stone, every fragment of wall was used to create a line the Tatars would have to break through if they wanted to pass. It wasn't a fortress in the classical sense, but it didn't need to be. It was enough to channel the enemy attack, to force the Tatars to come to them instead of using their mobility to encircle and crush. And that changed everything. Imagine the scene. 400 Polish cavalry, fully armored, positioned behind improvised barriers. Each hussar with his 4-meter lance pointed forward. Each Towarzysz with weapon in hand, ready to repel anything that breached the first line. The formation was tight, disciplined, no gaps, no obvious weaknesses. They knew what was coming. They knew there were no reinforcements. They knew that if that line broke, they would all die. Now imagine what the Tatars saw. A small entrenched force. 400 men against tens of thousands. To the Tatar commanders, this wasn't a battle. It was a joke, a formality. The math was ridiculous, 100-to-1 ratio. But there's something numbers don't capture, something proportions don't reveal. The hussars and Towarzysz weren't merely 400 men, they were 400 specialists. Warriors who had spent years mastering every aspect of mounted combat. Men who knew their weapons as extensions of their own bodies. Soldiers who trusted each other absolutely because they trained together, fought together, bled together. And they had something more, something that went beyond individual skill. They had geometry on their side. The fortified position wasn't merely physical defense. It was a geometric trap. The Tatars, accustomed to fighting in open field, now faced a confined space where their numerical advantage became almost irrelevant. It didn't matter if they had 40,000 men. Only a limited number could attack those barriers at the same time. The rest? Waiting. Watching. Unable to use their mobility because there was no space to maneuver. The Poles had transformed an impossible numerical disadvantage into a manageable equation. They didn't need to defeat 40,000 men at once. They needed to defeat however many could reach them at the same time. Perhaps 200, perhaps 300. Still terrifying numbers, but not impossible. Not for hussars. And there was another factor: armor. Those plates of heavy metal that covered every centimeter of Polish bodies weren't merely protection, they were nullification. Tatar arrows, lethal against unprotected targets, simply ricocheted off Polish steel. True, a well-placed arrow could still find a joint or opening, but most of them, useless. The Tatars could fire thousands of arrows and watch the majority of them bouncing helplessly off that wall of metal. Meanwhile, each Tatar charge against the barriers was met by 4-meter lances. Imagine trying to ride against a formation where each defender had the reach of 2 normal people. Before getting close enough to use your sword, you were already impaled. Before you could fire an arrow at close range, a lance was through your chest or your horse's chest. The stage was set. All the advantages the Tatars should have had, mobility, numbers, speed, had been neutralized by terrain, fortification, and discipline. Every slope, every improvised barrier, every inch of that defensive perimeter had been shaped for this moment. The Tatar force approached, tens of thousands of cavalry advancing toward 400 entrenched men. From the Polish perspective, it must have been like watching the entire horizon move. A sea of horses and men coming straight at you. The noise, the sound of hooves striking earth. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. A growing thunder that shook the ground and made the air vibrate. And from the Tatar perspective, confidence, absolute certainty. How could those 400 men possibly resist? How could they even hope to survive? It was a matter of minutes, maybe seconds. The first charge would sweep away those pathetic barriers, and the raid would continue as planned. But there was something the Tatars didn't understand. Something no amount of numbers could compensate for. The men behind those barriers weren't merely waiting to die, they were waiting to fight. And they had turned Hodov into a meat grinder. The distance closed, 500 meters, 400, 300. The Polish cavalry didn't move, didn't cry out, didn't break formation. Simply waited, lances leveled, armor gleaming, eyes fixed on what was coming. The Tatars accelerated. The charge began. Thousands of cavalry in coordinated movement, creating a wave of destruction that was supposed to swallow that small defensive force and leave nothing behind. And then, the first Tatar line hit the barriers. When that first charge struck the defensive line, something happened that no one expected. The Tatar cavalry, accustomed to crushing opponents through sheer speed, collided against a wall of armor and steel. The Polish lances, with their 4-meter length, reached the attackers long before the Tatars' curved swords could even touch the defenders. The noise of the collision echoed through the valley like metallic thunder. Men screamed, horses shrieked in panic. And when the dust settled enough to reveal the outcome, the first Tatar line was broken, retreating in disorder. 40,000 men had just been repelled by 400. But this wasn't capitulation. It was just the opening. The Tatar commanders, watching from a safe distance, understood immediately what had gone wrong. The formation was too dense. The improvised barriers were limiting maneuvering space. Fine. They would try again, from another angle, with another strategy. After all, they had 100 men for each pole. They could afford to be wrong again, and again, and again. The second charge came 15 minutes later. This time, the Tatars tried to flank. Archers fired clouds of arrows while cavalry sought gaps. But the perimeter was a complete defensive structure geometry calculated to deny any advantageous angle. The arrows ricocheted off Polish steel without causing damage. And wherever the attackers tried to concentrate pressure, there were the hussars with their lances, maintaining a lethal distance. The Tatars retreated again. Less coordinated this time, more frustrated. And then began the 3 most brutal hours any man on that field would witness in their entire lives. Charge after charge, wave after wave. The Tatars attacked with the determination of those who knew that retreating without victory would mean admitting defeat to an opponent 100 times smaller. Mounted archers circled the Polish position, trying to find favorable shooting angles. Light cavalry tried to draw the defenders out from behind the barricades. Tactical groups tested different sectors of the perimeter, searching for the breaking point, that moment when the Polish line would finally buckle under unbearable pressure. But that moment never came. The secret lay not in armor or lances. It lay in discipline. Every Polish hussar had trained for years for this type of defensive combat. Each Towarzysz Pancerny knew exactly his position, his role, when to attack and when to hold the line. There was no panic. There was no confusion. There was only cold, calculated execution of tactics that transformed numerical inferiority into strategic irrelevance. The Tatars had mobility. The Poles had geometry. And geometry, when applied with deadly precision, defeated mobility every single time. But after 3 hours of sustained combat, a new problem emerged. Polish ammunition was running out, arrows expended, firearm projectiles used up. And although the defensive formation remained intact, the ability to respond to ranged attacks was diminishing rapidly. Without effective counterattack capability, the Tatars could eventually find a way to break the line through sheer persistence. It was then that someone had an idea so simple, so obviously brilliant, that it would completely change the course of the battle. One of the Polish soldiers looked at the ground around the defensive position. Thousands of Tatar arrows, fired during hours of relentless assault, lay scattered everywhere. Perfectly usable arrowheads, just waiting to be collected. And what if, instead of waiting for ammunition to run out completely, the defenders began using the attackers' own weapons against them? The order passed down the line. Soldiers began collecting Tatar arrows from the ground during brief pauses between charges. Metal tips were checked, selected, and adapted where possible. And then, in the next wave of attack, the Tatars were met not only with defensive resistance, but with their own arrows being turned back against them. The irony wasn't lost. The attackers, who had tried to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume of projectiles, now involuntarily supplied the ammunition that would prolong their own defeat. Innovation under extreme pressure. Adaptation when failure meant total annihilation. This was more than military skill. It was mastery over chaos. The hours continued to pass. 4 hours of combat. 5. 6. The sun that had witnessed the battle's beginning started its descent toward the horizon. And on the field around the Polish position, evidence of accumulated carnage became impossible to ignore. Bodies. Hundreds of them. Thousands, maybe. Tatar knights who had charged with absolute confidence in the early hours now lay motionless victims of lances, arrows, or simply the collapse of horses beneath them during failed charges. Later estimates would suggest approximately 2,000 Tatar casualties over those 6 hours. 2,000 men dead attempting to break a line defended by only 400. Mathematically, that represented 5% of the attacking force. It doesn't sound like much until you realize what 5% attrition means in a strategic context. For every 20 men who began the battle, 1 was dead. For every tactical unit that launched the attack, 1/5 would never return. And all this without even cracking the Polish defensive formation. The numbers don't lie. And the numbers were telling the Tatar commanders something they didn't want to admit. Continuing to attack would result in more attrition with no guarantee of victory. The Polish position wasn't weakening. Defensive discipline wasn't breaking. And each additional minute of combat meant more men lost for zero strategic gain. The meat grinder had fulfilled its purpose. Not through superior technology or complex tactical tricks, but through something far more fundamental. Men trained to resist, equipped to survive, and disciplined enough to turn numerical inferiority into geometric advantage. But even with 2,000 dead and 6 hours of accumulated failure, the Tatars still had overwhelming numbers. 38,000 men remaining against 400 exhausted Poles. Technically, they could still win through sheer persistence. The problem was no longer physical capacity. It was psychological. You can order men to attack a fortified position once, maybe twice, maybe even 3 times if the motivation is strong enough. But after 20 failed charges, after seeing comrades die repeatedly without tactical result, after realizing that each assault ends the same disastrous way, something breaks inside soldiers. It's not cowardice. It's basic rationality. The human brain simply refuses to continue executing actions that have proven to be pointless suicide. And the Tatar commanders, looking at their own troops after 6 hours of brutal grinding, could see the signs. Hesitation before charges. Reduced intensity in attacks. Looks that clearly said, "Why are we still doing this?" The war machine that had begun the day with absolute confidence was now cracking under the weight of its own futility. It was then that the decision was made. A decision that, in any other context, would be considered absurd. A decision that proved, more than anything else, that the Poles had won not just tactically, but psychologically. The Tatars decided to negotiate, not to attack again, not to attempt one last desperate charge, to negotiate. With 400 men, they still outnumbered 100 to 1. They sent emissaries, specifically Lipka's Muslim Poles who spoke the language and knew the culture. Men who could approach the defensive line and make a proposal that, on the surface, seemed perfectly rational. Surrender. You fought bravely. You've proven your courage, but continuing is suicide. Accept honorable terms and leave alive. The message crossed the barricades. The Lipka emissaries approached with flags of truce, calm voices, logical arguments. 6 hours of combat, 2,000 dead. Ammunition probably exhausted. Exhaustion certainly setting in. What was the point in continuing when eventual defeat was mathematically inevitable? But something was wrong with this logic. Something that the Tatars, in their accumulated frustration, had completely lost sight of. If Polish defeat was inevitable, why were the Tatars asking for surrender instead of simply attacking again? After 6 hours of blood and failure, the Tatars tried something they'd never needed before: words instead of swords. The Lipkas approached the Polish lines. Muslims who spoke Polish, sent to convince their Christian cousins that surrender was the only rational choice. 6 hours of combat, 2,000 Tatars dead, and 500 men still holding firm behind their improvised barricades. The Polish response was brief. No. There would be no surrender. There would be no negotiation. The defenders had held for 6 hours against 100 times their number. They knew what the Tatars knew. If the line hadn't broken by now, it wouldn't break. The Tatar leadership realized something no commander wants to admit. They had lost the psychological battle. 40,000 men couldn't break 400. Every assault accumulated more casualties. Every charge returned with fewer cavalrymen. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. 2,000 dead, and the Polish defensive line remained intact. Continuing the assault would mean more deaths for no strategic gain. The invasion had already failed. The objective was swift plunder, not a prolonged siege against entrenched heavy cavalry. The Tatars had mobility. The Poles had geometry. And on that terrain, geometry won every time. The decision was made. The Tatar force began to withdraw. And so, 40,000 men retreated from 400. Not because they couldn't fight anymore, because they couldn't win. The invasion was abandoned entirely. No plunder. No territory captured. No victory. Only 2,000 bodies left behind, and the devastating realization that overwhelming numbers meant nothing when facing absolute discipline in a fortified position. For the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this was more than a defensive victory. It was a strategic demonstration. Tatar invasions depended on speed and intimidation. Hodov proved that well-positioned heavy cavalry could turn a 100-to-1 advantage into a deadly trap. The frontier was secure. Future invasions would be reconsidered. So why does this battle remain obscure? Why isn't Hodov as famous as Thermopylae or the Alamo? Because it was overshadowed by even greater Polish victories. Kirchholm in 1605, where 3,500 Poles destroyed 11,000 Swedes. Klushino in 1610, where 6,800 Poles annihilated 35,000 Russians and Swedes. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had so many improbable victories that Hodov simply got lost in the noise. Moreover, it occurred during the Ottoman Empire's decline, outside the major theaters of conflict that dominate European historical narratives. Polish-Tatar conflicts were frontier wars, not campaigns that changed empires. No great treaty was signed after Hodov. No king was deposed. It was a defensive victory in a long series of border skirmishes. but that makes it no less extraordinary. Proportionally, Hodov may be the most unequal battle in history. 100 to 1. 6 hours. 2,000 invaders dead. 400 defenders still standing. It's proof that discipline defeats numbers when environmental factors align. It validates that elite training and equipment superiority can transform impossible disadvantages into defensive victories. It's the definitive demonstration that tactical mastery can overcome crushing odds when every strategic element is executed perfectly. 400 Polish cavalrymen proved that when elite training meets environmental advantage and unshakable discipline, even 100 to 1 odds become survivable. This wasn't luck. This was tactical mastery. Strategic genius transformed into bloody reality on a forgotten battlefield. And perhaps that's the most important lesson Hodov offers. Victories aren't determined solely by who has more soldiers. They're determined by who uses their soldiers more intelligently, by who transforms the environment into a weapon, by who refuses to break even when every logical calculation says defeat is inevitable. Because in the end, when the Tatars withdrew and the dust settled, what remained wasn't a story about numbers. It was a story about what trained, disciplined, and determined men can achieve when they refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable. If you found this hidden battle as extraordinary as I did, tell me in the comments which other underdog victories you want me to cover. There are dozens of battles like Hodov buried in history, waiting to be rediscovered. Impossible confrontations where the side with fewer resources found a way to win through pure tactical ingenuity. And if you appreciate deep tactical analysis of history's most improbable battles, subscribe, because we're just getting started. There are hundreds of years of forgotten conflicts where the odds were impossible, the strategies brilliant, and the results defied all expectations. Hodov is just the beginning, because history isn't written by those with the most soldiers. It's written by those who refuse to lose.